All right. Good morning, everybody. My name is Joanne Snapp, and I am a temporary pre-health advisor with PPAC. And today we're going to talk about preparing to interview for medical, dental, pharmacy, PA, all of the different health profession programs. So today's presentation is a little bit of a big picture overview. We're not going to get into a lot of nitty-gritty interview prep per se, but we're going to talk about just different types of questions and how to prepare for those different types of questions and some logistical preparation as well. So let's talk about timeline, because I think that a lot of folks maybe have some expectations in terms of when interviews should come through and what happens if they don't come through. And I just want to clear that up a little bit. So generally speaking, interviews can come through anytime between July of the year that you apply. So that would be like right now, all the way through the following spring. I picked April because April is very common. That's usually the month, like the last month medical schools will interview. But truthfully, I have seen people get interviews to all different health professions, including medical school, after April. So actually, med school interviews, most health profession school interviews can technically go from July to July. It is very rare that some of the doctoral level fields like medicine, dentistry, it's very rare that they will interview in July of the fall, like right before you start. But if I told you I've never seen a med school interview come through in July, I would be lying to you. So it's a long process. It's a long season of interviews. And I think the expectation with people sometimes is that they'll finish writing their secondary applications, in August, September, and then they just expect the interviews are just going to come pouring in right after they finish those. And that can be really stressful when that actually doesn't happen. And for a lot of people, the interviews are going to trickle in over the course of several months. They don't come pouring in all at once. So people could get one interview in August and then not get another interview until November. And that waiting period is really hard for people. So I think just knowing ahead of time that how the process works, that it's not that you're going to get them all at once, and it's not that they're going to come consistently. They can come anytime. I've had people not get any interviews until January and then get 5 interviews after January. So you got to be patient. You have to get stay busy during this time frame, get hobbies, get jobs, just keep your mind busy. You can't just sit there and refresh your email over and over waiting for interviews. It'll make you obviously not feel very good. So how far in advance notice you get once you get an interview really varies by school and time of the year. Some schools will invite you to interview, and they'll have a portal online, and you get to pick your date, and the date range can go all the way, through several months. You might not have an interview for 3 or 4 months away. And I have had people who have gotten interview invites for the next day or 2 days later. And sometimes you have a lot of options for dates, and sometimes they give you your date and time and you don't get to pick. So there's no consistency there. You really shouldn't have any expectations with that. You kind of have to be a little flexible, and hopefully over this next year, whatever year you're applying, you have yourself in a position where if you need to jump online for an interview 2 days later, you're capable of doing that. Since hypothetically, this is supposed to be, the biggest thing you're doing right now. You're trying to go to a professional school. You just sort of have to be available. And that's hard, especially if you're working full time. So you might figure out how to have that conversation with your supervisor so that that's possible. Oftentimes, I wanted to address this too, because it's very, very common. When people submit their schools and they are waiting for an interview, a lot of times they'll get put on what's called an interview hold, which just means that they basically made the cut for screening, but there were so many people who are perfectly great candidates that qualify for interviews that they put a lot of people on hold. And I mean, it doesn't mean you did anything wrong. It just means there's too many people and they can't invite everybody at the same time, because then the spots would just fill up all the way through the end of the season. So what they do is they roll people out with interview invites slowly over the season. And there are ways you can get off the interview hold, like sending a letter of interest or sending update emails or going to an info session or, just if you go to a conference and generally express your interest, there are ways you can stand out to them, which may help you get off a hold, but sometimes it just means you have to wait. And that's, again, hard for people to just wait, but that is part of the process. But if you get put on hold, I wouldn't overthink it too much. It really doesn't mean you did anything wrong. There's a lot of people who don't get put on holds. So if you got put on a hold, that means your application was fine. Okay, so scheduling your interview, almost always they are online. And like I said, sometimes they give you options. If you do end up having a conflict where you can't go on the date that they assign to you, it's perfectly okay for you to communicate that with them. It's okay to write an email and just share that you have something going on that date. Sometimes the conflict is another interview, and that's okay. Like, that's a good problem to have. So they understand if you're a competitive applicant and you have multiple interviews, that's nothing to be ashamed of. That's nothing you have to be, something you have to hide. You can literally just say, I have another interview scheduled that day. Can I schedule it for a different day? They're not going to be mad at you because you already had something scheduled. Oftentimes they will, just accommodate that. And if you are put on a wait list, or if you are scheduled to interview, and let's say your interview is all the way in March and it's like September, you can email them and ask if you can get put on a wait list for an earlier date. It's something not a lot of people think to do. But if you want to interview sooner and you email them and let them know that, and somebody else cancels, then they will call you and you have to say, like, I'm willing to come at short notice. And if you are willing to come at short notice, then anytime somebody cancels their interview, you might be the first one they call to get that earlier date. So just some strategies in case you wanted to interview sooner. And I always get asked, is it better to do in-person or Zoom interviews? And some schools are doing in-person, some are only Zoom. Again, varies drastically by fields and programs. I personally, I know that going in person costs money, and I know it's an inconvenience. I also think that if you're going to go spend 4 years at a place and spend quite a lot of money on this education, it actually might benefit you to go see the place before you choose it. And so I'm a big fan of in-person interviews. I don't know that it actually gives you more of an advantage. I can't imagine that going in person would hurt you because it shows your strong interest. I also think that if you can't do it for whatever reason and you just you do your interviews on Zoom, you're absolutely okay too. But there's hopefully only once in a lifetime, right, that you get to apply. And there's only once in a lifetime that you get to go to an in-person interview for the schools you're going to. So big fan of going if you can. I think it's a good experience. You'll have a great time if you do end up going. Okay, so there's open and closed file interviews, and you'll hear this and you may see on their interview email that, or information when they share your information about your interview day, you'll see whether the file or the interview is open or closed. Basically, there can also be a partially closed, which means that the interviewer has your personal statement, has your letters of rec, but does not have your grades or your scores. So closed is generally to reduce bias. They don't want the person to know how you did academically. That person is generally only looking at you as a person in terms of your personality. So usually student interviewers are closed interviews. They have your story in front of them, but they don't know anything about how you did. This is why when you're interviewing, you don't have to be forthcoming all the time with all this, every single problem you had in college, if you had any academic problems, because sometimes they don't even know about it. So if you bring it up and they didn't ask about it, then you're actually just outing yourself in terms of any challenges you had, and they have no context to understand that challenge. So I'm not saying hide it, but sometimes people will just be very forthcoming and just share all of the challenges they had, and the person may not have even known about that. If the person has your application, oftentimes you'll know it because they will ask you a question from your application. They'll say, oh, I saw you did whatever. Tell me more about that. They also may ask you if you did have any, hiccups in college. They'll probably ask you about that. So what happened in OChem when you got that C-? And you'll be like, yeah, OChem got the best of me, right? So very common for both. There isn't one that's more common than the other. And you don't really change your strategy. It's just more like FYI. If they have my information, maybe you can refer to it. You can say, well, you read my personal statement. You already remember this about me. Otherwise, you just treat it exactly the same way. All right, so today we're going to talk about different interview types, the traditional one-on-one interview, the multiple mini interview, a group or panel interview, and then the Cura assessment. I'm actually going to work backwards, and I'm going to talk about the Cura assessment first because there isn't too much to say about that. But the Cura assessment is relatively new in the last 5 years. Med schools, I think a couple of PA schools. I don't remember if any pharmacy schools are doing it, but it is becoming more common that they're using this platform. Kira is just the name of the platform. They honestly can use a different platform. We just call it Kira. It's basically a self-recorded interview. So they will send you a link to a platform where it'll basically post a question. It'll give you 30 seconds or 1 minute to read the question. Then the camera turns on and you're being recorded and you answer the question. And usually you'll have anywhere from 1 minute to 5 minutes. I would say the average is about a minute and a half to answer the question. Then a camera stops, a new question pops up, you answer it, and back it does that however many times, 5 or 6 times. So the questions that they can ask you are school dependent, and there's generally no way to know what the questions will be, just like any interview. And so people get stressed about this because we feed off each other's, visual or facial feedback. And with Kira, you don't have that, right? You only have you and yourself in the camera. One thing I've always told people is if you're a TikTok recorder or you like recording yourself on Instagram, just pretend like you're doing that. Imagine the audience in front of you behind the camera. They are watching you. So you're going to have to perform being an energetic, friendly person. You are going to want to be dynamic when you're talking to the best of your ability. So whatever question they ask you, you need to talk to the camera like you're talking to a person. So think about the way you talk to a patient when you walk into a room, when you greet them, capture that tone, that friendliness. That's what you want to sort of embody, even though you're still on camera and you don't feel like you're talking to anybody. So that's more of like a performance you're going to have to do when you answer the questions. And they are becoming more and more popular. I know at least 2 schools in California are using them. And I keep hearing every year more and more schools are doing it. So maybe some of you have already seen that, and even at the secondary phase. Okay, so let's keep going. So the basics, I call the basics the traditional interview, like the beginning stages of interview prep. So our basic questions that we are all going to be prepared for. Tell me about yourself, why medicine, PA, pharmacy, whatever field, why the school, which you can't really prep for until you have your first interview. You should know what your strengths and weaknesses are. You should have some kind of saying that's like, why should we pick you? What's the value you bring to me? And that is a little bit different than, why medicine or why us. It's sort of weaving you and them together. So why should we pick you? Because I bring value to your school. I am a good fit for your school for these reasons. And so you have to find the reasons at the school and then tie yourself to those reasons, which is similar to why us, but a little bit more centered on the value that you bring to them. And then the anything else question is like a closing argument. You get usually, if you think about yourself in a courtroom, you have 2 minutes to close, tell that jury anything you want. Well, you want to tell the admissions committee that they should pick you. And why should they pick you? Because you're a good fit for the school, because you bring some value to them, because there's something that pulls you together. So if they say, is there anything else you want to tell the committee? Or if you could tell the committee anything, what would it be? It would essentially be, I believe I would be a great fit for your school because of A, B, and C, and you weave you and them together. So all of these basic questions, I would argue almost all traditional interview questions need to be around 3 minutes or less. I would say 3 minutes is pushing it. And the reason I say that is because we want this to be conversational. And most of these interviews are going to be conversational in nature. And the reason how we know they're conversational is whatever you say and tell me about yourself. So you start off with, I was born and raised here. I grew up doing these things, lived around these people, did a lot of this, this, and this. So if you're a musician, artist, or athlete, that should come out there. Work your way up to what you're doing nowadays. But whatever you say in that, tell me about yourself. If their next question is something pulled from that, like, Oh, that's really interesting. You play tennis. My son plays tennis. What's your favorite? Blah, blah, blah. If that's how it's going, then you know at that point it's a conversation. Then all of the prep you did for an interview kind of goes out the window because you need to just sit and have a conversation with somebody. And if you are not a good conversationalist, you can't just wing it. Everything has to be like a formal answer. That is going to be an extremely awkward interaction because that person just wants to talk to you. So you have to be able, just like you would with a patient who comes into your room, you have to be able to chit chat and just build rapport with a person who you don't know anything about. So that's a conversational interview. If the following question after tell me about yourself is, okay, thank you. So why medicine? Then you know, okay, we're doing a real traditional interview here. That means they're going down the list. They have a set of questions. They're going to ask you questions. In that case, no, I would say in either case, you need to keep your timing under 3 minutes because you don't want this to sound like a PowerPoint presentation. You know, some presentations you give in class are 5 minutes long. So if you are talking at them for 5 straight minutes and you're expecting them to pay close attention to everything you're saying for 5 straight minutes, you're asking a lot of your listener. And, you know, to be honest, a lot of us have ADHD and we've been watching these reels and they're like, what, 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes. Our brains are kind of wired right now. Like we need quick and, quick answers. We need things to be moving. So keep your answers concise. If they want to know more about something you're saying, they will actually just ask you, oh, that was really interesting. You mentioned that. Tell me more about that. Or what did you mean when you said this? Let them ask you because that brings out the conversation. If you over explain and put so much detail in every single thing you say, it's going to just feel like you're talking at them forever. They're going to be like, I don't even want to ask any more questions because this person never stops talking. So you got to have some social awareness, which means knowing when to stop talking. Okay, so those are the basic questions everybody can be practicing right now, regardless of whether you have an interview. The odds of you getting one of these questions is high at some point in your life. All right, behavioral questions are the second most used type of question in any kind of interview. And these are questions that sound like, tell me about a time when, tell me about a time when you failed, tell me about a time you worked with a difficult person. And we're going to go through those a little bit more specifically. And then the questions for us, everybody should have at least 3 or 4 questions going into any interview day that is about the school, but you need to think about the different people you're going to meet that day and have different questions for different kinds of people. So have a question for the admissions team, have a question for a faculty member, for a student, because not every question is appropriate for every person. So if you're meeting with a faculty member, you should never ask a faculty member like any kind of technical or logistical questions. Like never during your interview should you ask when should we expect to hear back? Like that's not appropriate. So definitely not to a faculty member. So a faculty member question would be more centered around the curriculum or research opportunities or maybe clinical training, depending on what area in the school they teach. So if they're teaching the biomedical sciences, then that'd be more about like what is the assessments look like? What do office hours look like? You can ask questions that are more about what your education will be like. Being an educated consumer means that you care about what you're, quote, purchasing in the sense that this is the school you might be going to. So you want to be smart about which school you're picking. You don't have to flatter them by just asking questions about like, well, where did you go to med school? And what do you like best about working here? And because that's really about the interviewer. It's not really about you and that particular school and the chances of you going to that school. So, not chances, I mean like the chances of you going to that school after an interview are high. So you want to show that you are actually interested in them, that you want to learn about that. Okay, so preparing for behavioral interviews, the best way to prepare is to think about a lot of examples, stories from your past that you can use and tailor to different types of questions. So the best way to prepare is think of these stories. Maybe we sit down and jot out 5 different stories from your past. And then you're going to literally just walk around talking out loud with your stories. You're going to tell your stories. What you want to do is practice telling these stories so often that these stories are just very second nature to you. and you've worked out all the kinks. You've worked out the irrelevant details. You figured out which details you want to include. You can tell them in a really dynamic way. So you're going to be like a really cool storyteller. So once you have these stories memorized, then when you hear the question, you're going to go through your story bank and you're going to go, okay, which story makes the most sense for what they're assessing in me? And then you're going to take the story, you're going to highlight, zoom in, shine a spotlight on the actual behavior that they're measuring in that particular question. So if they ask you, tell me about a time when you worked with a difficult person, you got to go through your stories. Okay. Here's a patient, we had a difficult time. Zoom into the behavior of the patient. Maybe you use the same story in a different interview where they say, tell me about a time when you had to make a decision and you didn't have a lot of information. So in that point, maybe the patient's difficulty isn't the main part of that story. Instead, you're zooming in on a different part of that story where you weren't sure what to do moving forward with that kind of detail. So same story, different questions. You only have to memorize, I would say 5 or 6 stories at the most, and get really good at telling them, and then just practice tailoring the same stories to different questions. So it's that spotlight skill set that we want to use, figuring out where to shine the spotlight on your stories, because we want to center the behavior that they're measuring in you. So if they say a difficult person, there are competencies they're measuring, right? If you've worked with a difficult person, you should have conflict resolution, you should have professionalism, communication skills, you should have some empathy, taking time to understand what's going on in this person's life. So you have to actually show those things in your answer. And that means just tailoring your story a little bit to make that part shine. Learning about the school helps you, because when you get to the end of the answer, if there's some way, shape, or form to pull an aspect of that school into your answer, that makes the answer even better. So if you're talking about, let's say you're talking about a difficult person, you get to the end of your answer and you say, I know when I'm doing my clinical rotations at the blah, blah, blah hospital, it's inevitable I'm going to bump into a difficult person at some point. Even just a little detail, like knowing the name of the hospital, knowing the city name, knowing anything about the school. If you could pull that in your answer, it goes, wow, they're actually thinking about us. They did their research. They know enough about us to just comfortably do that. And so that takes a lot of effort on your part. It takes time to go and memorize everything about a particular school when you interview. And sometimes people are like, well, I don't have time to do that. And okay, you can say you don't have time to do a lot of things. This is your chance, right? Like you get basically one shot at getting into that school on your interview day. In my opinion, if you've already invested this much money and time in this process, I would do everything humanly possible to do well on this interview, which means knowing everything about that school, the city, the demographics of it. I would look up issues, current events in the state. I would look at the state of healthcare in the state. I would just know everything about them, because the more you know, the more confident and comfortable you're going to feel in that interview. It's not that you're actually going to ever say all of the stuff but you have no idea. Maybe you're going to get into a discussion with somebody about something and you'll say, oh yeah, I saw that legislation going through right now in the state of Tennessee about blah, 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 blah. That's really interesting. Like just the fact that you know that is going to wow that interviewer. And you have no idea the power that can have on whether you get accepted or waitlisted. So it is absolutely worth it to spend the time researching the school, because no matter what they ask you, there's always, I shouldn't say always, that's a little hyperbolic. There's usually a way to pull some aspect of that school into your answer. Okay. MMIs are becoming increasingly popular. I don't know what percentage of schools actually do MMIs, but it is likely you'll have an MMI maybe once throughout your season. If you're a pre-med, probably more than once. So an MMI is a typical interview, but you get 10, up to 10, 8 to 10 interviews, and they're back to back, and they're 6 to 8 minute rounds. So before everything went online, they actually would have people come and stand outside of rooms, and they would rotate through the rooms. You would stand outside a door, read the prompt, walk into the door. You would have 8 minutes to answer the question. The bell would ring, you come out, you move to the next door. So obviously we don't have doors anymore. We have rooms, we have Zoom rooms. So you're going to literally go from one Zoom room to the next, and you'll have a prompt. You'll have 2 minutes to think about it. You'll go in the room, the camera turns on, and you start talking to the person in front of you. Literally over the last couple of years, I have heard every type of interview question being asked in MMIs: traditional, behavioral, scenario, SJTs, ethical, and social policy questions. So, you really do prepare for an MMI. You prepare for everything when you do an MMI, because there's no way to know what kinds of questions unless you know someone who, interviewed at the school and said, hey, they were mostly this or they were mostly that. Most people are not going to tell you all the questions they got, because they shouldn't, but they can tell you generally, like, hey, you really should prep for more of this and this. Based on what my applicants have told me over the years, it seems like it's really a hodgepodge of different questions. And so you prep for everything. The interviewer has no background info on you. So when you walk into the room, they know nothing about you besides your name. So you can go in and you do not want to share too much. You want to share the answer to the question to the best of your ability. You want to provide stories. You want to support their answer with evidence, or their question with evidence, but you are not going to tell them your whole life story, more than likely, unless that's the question. We're trying not to create bias. So the point of an MMI is to reduce bias. They used to not chat with you. They used to just stare at you and you answer the question. More and more, I'm hearing that the MMI interviewers are chatting with you. And so that's an interesting kind of twist on things, because traditionally they were not trying to have bias. They were trying to be as unbiased and objective as possible. So obviously chit-chatting creates some kind of bias, because if you can chit-chat with somebody easily, you're going to like them easier. And if somebody is not as great at just having those types of informal conversations on the fly, then you would be disadvantaged in that case. So MMIs were supposed to eliminate that and just give people the opportunity to answer the question, and you were supposed to be judged only on the question. So I don't know. I don't know why they've switched and gone a little bit more on the chit-chatty realm, but that's what I'm hearing is happening. So they're doing both. Interviewers are not faculty or staff necessarily. They can be anybody. They could be a med student. They can be a support staff. They could be admissions. It could be anybody under the sun. You have no idea who they are. They don't tell you their name. So you're just talking to a person. You don't know what their background is. Sometimes the room will oftentimes the room will close when the time is up without any warning. You should have a clock going on when you're in the Zoom room, so you should see your timing. So you need to practice once you know what kind of interview you have, and if it's an MMI, how much time you have. You can find that information online. You have to practice the timing. If you don't practice the timing and you run out of time, you will get cut off mid-sentence. They don't care. And that could be really stressful for you. And I've heard people over the years tell me that they held back parts of their answer because they wanted to save time, because they wanted the time to ask questions at the end. But the thing is this is, again, like, your answer is being compared against the other people's answers that day. So you're going to get a score based on how well you answer that question. And they typically have a list of things they're looking for in your answer. So the more things you say, the more likely it is you're going to get more points. So if you hold things back, you're potentially not getting as many points. They typically will ask you questions afterwards because they're trying to help you get more points. So if you missed some major things in that question, they're going to ask you follow-ups because they're trying to help you. So people will deliberately leave things off so that they have to ask you questions to do it. If you had already thought of those things, just tell them so that you don't have to be asked, right? It would make more sense just to tell them everything. Then if there's any natural conversation at the end, let that happen. But you're not trying to make it seem like you don't know the answer and that they need to ask you for help. Does that make sense? So don't do that. Don't hold back because you want to leave room for conversation. Just give them the best answer you can possibly give them. They're going to give you a score based on whatever criteria you've met for that question. At the end of the day, they average your scores. You get one overall score. They rank everybody based on that overall score. And that's hypothetically how they decide who to accept. So the top scored people get it. So the thing about MMIs is you should never strive for perfection. If you think you need to be perfect in these, they will actually raise red flags. They'll think that you got the questions ahead of time and that you've been practicing, which is a big no-no. So don't strive for perfection, just strive for deep, thoughtful answers that actually answer the question, give good examples, tie back to the school, tie back to the field. You don't have to be perfect, you just have to be thoughtful. And you don't have to be perfect, you just have to do better than other people on the same interview day. So that's also sometimes reassuring, as if you mess up one station, you have the next 7 stations to bounce back. It's all averaged out. Every question that you're going to get in any interview, and with an MMI, you have 2 minutes to think about it, but every question has a purpose. Very rarely are questions random. Sometimes I guess you could have a interviewer who just wants to mess with you and ask you some random question, but generally they have a purpose. So if you can figure out in the minutes that you're thinking, what are they trying to assess in me with this question? What is the point, right? And if you think about what they're asking you, how does it relate to your future? So if you're going to be a pharmacist or a dentist, whatever it is, think about the question in relation to your future field. And if you can think about how that question is predicting your behavior, your thoughts, your actions in the future in that particular field, then whatever answer you give should reflect how you're going to behave in the future. So you need to think of a story or example. Your answer needs to be basically what they're looking for is like, how are you going to behave when you become a dentist? So you got to think like that. Think in the future. Why are they asking me this? What are they measuring in me? What type of skill set or knowledge are they looking for? And then when you answer the question, show them what they would expect you to do in the future. But use a current example to demonstrate that. When I put explicate the prompt, what I mean is the prompt was handwritten carefully. Every word, every detail in that prompt was selected for a particular reason. So oftentimes people will hear a prompt and they'll ignore certain parts of it, and they'll only focus on, I guess, the part that's easiest for them to answer. Or they'll just ignore a detail about something in the prompt. But that prompt was written, so you need to make sure that the school actually wrote that. They picked that word. If there's a word in there and you don't know why they're asking you that, you need to address it. You could say, when I see that, you mentioned this, and this, it makes me think about implicit bias. It makes me think about maybe the potential for me to have some bias about this person because of that particular detail you included. And then you can talk about that and explain that. But there's a reason they put everything in there, and they definitely are doing that because they want you to address it. So this is a formula that we have used for different types of scenario questions. So if you get a question like, imagine you are in an operating room and somebody comes in smelling, like alcohol. That's a very common situation that's twisted for different situations, whether it's, it could be alcohol can be swapped within other substances, operating room can be swapped with other situations, but essentially it's the same problem. First, you always acknowledge the complicated nature of that problem. So that buys you a few seconds to think it through. Why is this a situation bad for you? You want to list out why it is a problem. So I'm a medical student and I'm, in an operating room with a bunch of other professionals, and my colleague comes in smelling like alcohol. Well, that's going to put me in kind of a precarious situation because I really want to tell on my peer. At the same time, coming to the space intoxicated is absolutely not okay. So this, that's the problem, right? You need to actually name the problem. And so you want to spell that out for them. I have to decide if I'm going to do this or this. Because if you don't do that, then you're assuming they know that, but they don't know that you know that. So you can't just assume that they can read your mind. You have to literally tell them your thought process the entire way. And then to explore which decision you're going to make, whether you're going to do X or Y, you can use if-then statements. And so recognize how your decision is going to impact everybody in the room. So if I were to pull my colleague aside and ask them how, how their morning has been, I might mention I do smell something on their breath. Then if they respond well to that, then I will, respond this way. If I do that and they get angry or defensive and deny it, even though they're clearly intoxicated, then I will do this. So it's okay to explore the scenario in different ways using if-then statements, because it shows the listener that you're reasoning through all of your options, and you want to literally like lay out all your options for them. They want to know that you can make those types of decisions, but in real life, we make those decisions within like split seconds in our brain. With SJTs, it's almost like putting your brain on slow-mo and showcasing all of those all that decision making going on in your head, but you want to say it out loud so that they can see how you are rationalizing through your decision making. There's usually some kind of personal or professional consequence or ramification for the decision you're going to make. That's the whole essence of an ethical dilemma. So if you say, telling on my friends will save the patient from being harmed, but at the same time, I'm going to lose a friend here. And this is someone who I've trusted and who I've really enjoyed working with. They are not going to be happy with me after this day. And I recognize that. And that's a consequence I have to face. So you're going to ultimately say what you want to do, justify it again, pull in a personal anecdote if you have time. So a time when I also was faced with a similar challenge was blah, blah, blah. And then we're going to tie it to our future. And so the things you want to pay attention to here, often there's some issue of hierarchy. There's someone higher than you, above you, older than you, something that are friends, like so our social group. There's usually some situation where you have to challenge hierarchy. And that's a really common thing. It's good to acknowledge that. Like the fact that this is an older, dentist makes me a little bit more nervous to say this, because we typically, growing up, I was taught to respect my elders. If they wrote that the provider was an older provider, they are absolutely hitting on that. They could have put any age, they could have left off the age, but if they put older, that means they are looking for you to acknowledge that. Generally, places have policies. You want to acknowledge that you will follow the policy. Even if the policy isn't explicitly stated, you want to acknowledge that there might be a policy on this and that you will follow whatever the policy is. So if there's an issue of, coming to work intoxicated, you will say, there's likely a policy that states that you are not to come to work intoxicated. And therefore, if the policy states that I should report this person, I'm going to follow the policy. It's not a moral decision anymore. It's a policy decision. And that shows that you're rational and that you know how to follow rules. And then if there's consequences for that, you want to acknowledge that. So even though I am following policy, there will be a consequence for me. Again, my friend that I've been good friends with for 2 years is no longer going to like me after this. It's something I have to deal with. If there's any unknowns about what's like, I don't know what's going to happen if I do this, or I don't know why, I don't know, just say what you don't know. It's okay. Again, that shows that you are rational, that you're thinking about that. And then if there's any obvious bias, obviously point it out. Don't ignore bias situations. Another type of question that's out there are things about social determinants of health. So things like, tell me about how poverty impacts health. Tell me about ways that, or why people are unhealthy outside of the hospital. If you should be extremely fluent on this when you enter the interview stage. If you don't feel 100% confident, if I asked you to talk about, 5 different social determinants of health, and you couldn't off the top of your head tell me about them and the ways that the determinants impact health, then you want to do some reading. And there are tons of articles, there are books, there are lots of stuff, YouTube channels, TED Talks, all of it. You should absolutely be able to talk about all of these things. You should know the difference between a health and a healthcare disparity. You should know some of the health inequities in the state that you're interviewing at. A lot of times people just assume that what's true in their state is true for other states. This came up one day when I was talking to somebody who was interviewing in a Florida school, and they were talking about needing Spanish-speaking providers. And I've worked with a lot of Florida applicants in the past, and actually they don't have a problem with Spanish-speaking providers in Florida. There's actually a lot of Spanish-speaking providers in Florida. And so knowing the actual challenges and making sure that what you're saying makes sense. I remember one time someone was interviewing for a school in at Cornell, interviewing for an interview at Cornell, and he was talking about all the challenges with rural medicine. And I was like, do you know where Cornell is located? And he's like, yeah, in upstate New York. Well, you have to at least know where your school is located, because it's not, it was in New York City. So it made no sense that he was going on and on about the inequities of rural medicine. So you need to know, you need to do this kind of reading ahead of time. You need to feel confident going into the interview, knowing about the challenges that exist around the school. And that starts with knowing the school, knowing where it's at. So I would encourage you to do this type of reading. It's going to help you in the long run. You'll feel more confident in these conversations. Okay, and then last, after your interview, it is very common that you will feel like you want to send a thank you note. The schools will sometimes tell you exactly what they want you to do, and it is important that you follow the school's directions. If they tell you do not email thank you notes, then you simply don't email thank you notes. If they tell you to upload the thank you notes in their portal, you do that. And I don't care how bad you want to do the other thing. I don't care that you always send cards to the school, because if the school tells you not to send the card and you're like, but I always do, nobody cares that you always do. You don't send the card to the school. You do whatever they tell you to do. If you can't follow their basic directions, that to them is a red flag. So find out what they want you to do. They usually will tell you, because there's thousands of people doing this, and most schools do not want to get thousands of emails with thank you notes. If it's an MMI, what most people do is they just send one email or one upload and address it to the admissions office and just thank everybody for a wonderful day. You don't have to literally thank every single interviewer one at a time. Most people send these within 24 hours. If you don't, it's 48 hours, or God forbid, 36 whatever hours. Just, it's fine. Like, it's not the end of the world. But the longer you wait, I would assume, like, the less impact it's going to have. I don't actually think it's going to have that much of an impact, but I just would say if you're going to do it quickly. And then if you're going to do it, make sure they're professional and well written and rational. That is extremely important. I used to work at a medical school, and I remember one time a person sent a letter. It was after her interview. It was a little bit after her interview, because she had gone through committee and she was on the list to get accepted. And in one of her communications, she had written this like beautiful over the top love letter for the school. It was so over the top, almost like a poem. It was not professional. And it ended up costing her an acceptance. She ended up going from being on the acceptance list to the wait list, just because of how she wrote her communication. So your communication, every single communication you send is being judged, even the emails you send. So if you're writing emails in all lowercase, if you're sending emails that have like, hey, so-and-so, not dear doctor, whatever, all of that is being judged. And absolutely they are copying and pasting that and putting that in your application, and or just straight up saying no. So every single thing you do with a school is fair game for judgment, and you have to act like on your A game the entire time. Your every form of communication. If you do go in person, the minute you walk in the door, the minute you walk in that city, actually, you are being judged, and you need to be aware of yourself and your behavior. You need to be aware of your tone, your facial expressions, every single thing, even on your phone. I remember when I used to run interview days at the med school, I would go in the bathroom, and I remember listening to an applicant one time after her interview. She went into the stall and was calling her mom and was just like telling her mom all this stuff. And I was like sitting in the stall, like 2 doors down, like listening. And I'm like, what the heck? Like, I felt a little offended at some of the things she was saying. And I'm like, I'm the director of admissions, and I'm listening to you say this stuff about my school. How do you think I'm going to respond to that? So you really just have to watch yourself, like everywhere you are in that building. You're not safe to talk about anything. Even if you are at lunch with a medical student, or at any kind of function with other students, don't let your guard down. Don't think that you can just act unprofessional or casual or whatever. You can be casual, you can be friendly. Just don't cross the line and say things that are not appropriate or not professional, because again, even though if they tell you, hey, this is casual, you can just relax, be yourself, if it is related to an interview, No, you cannot. You need to be on, have your guard up the entire time. So it goes without saying, interviews are professional. You need to have a suit jacket or a blazer. You need to have a decent shirt, put some effort into your appearance. I'm not saying you have to go purchase a very expensive outfit, nothing like that. You just need to look like you would want to walk into, any type of professional environment ready to work. Okay, I'm going to stop there and see if anybody has any questions about anything that I presented. No questions? Okay. Well, if we don't have any questions, then I guess I wish you all the best. And if you need to do any type of interview prep, if you need help with that, feel free to make an appointment with your advisor. We're happy to help with that. And I wish you all the best and good luck on this journey. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. It was very helpful.
Thanks.
Thank you. I came in late, but I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah.